This is the February 16th regular meeting of the Fairhaven Planning Board. Adequate notice of this meeting has been given pursuant to the provisions of the Open Public Meetings Act. At the time of the board's reorganization in January of this year, the board adopted its regular meeting schedule for the year. Notice of the schedule of the board's regular meetings was sent to and published in the Asbury Park Press and was also sent to the Two River Times and the Star Ledger. Tonight's meeting was listed in the notice of the scheduled regular meetings. That notice was also posted on the bulletin board in Borough Hall and has remained continuously posted there as required by the statute. In addition, a copy of the notice is and has been available to the public and is on file in the office of the Borough Clerk. A copy of the notice has also been sent to such members of the public as have requested such information in accordance with the statute. Adequate notice having been given, the board secretary is directed to include this statement in the minutes of the meeting. Roll call, please, Judy.
Mr. Bordelon,
Here.
Ms. Bush,
Here.
Mrs. Koch,
Here.
Mr. Newell,
Here.
Mr. Paolo,
Here.
Mr. Rolfe,
Here.
Mr. Nitka. No, Mr. Nitka. Mr. Burkhart. This is D'Angelo.
Here.
Okay, is Mrs. Murray being sworn in for this meeting?
Yeah, we're going to do that next.
Okay, Mrs. Murray is here, and Mr. Leader?
I'm here.
Okay.
All right, very good. Would you join me in a pledge to the flag, please? Can we post the flag? You know how to do that, Teresa?
I don't have a flag top.
All right, you're all going to pretend that you see the flag. I pledge allegiance to the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, under God, liberty and justice for all. I really messed that up and no one participated. That was really a lot of pressure and I failed. Okay, but thank you, Mike, for showing your flag.
We were all on mute.
It was terrible, really embarrassed. Okay, so we've had a rough start to this meeting. I'm going to try and get everything under control and explain to everybody why everybody is here. First of all, this is a planning board meeting. The planning board was intending to have this meeting and have this as an informational session. We went ahead and invited the council and we invited the zoning board to join in this meeting for informational purposes. And what's happened is that as a result of their requirements with regard to giving notice to the public when a quorum of those bodies are gathering, we gave notice that both council and zoning board were meeting tonight as well. Nevertheless, this is a planning board meeting. We have about 10 minutes of open planning board business that we're going to address. We'll move through that rather quickly. Once we're through with that, the planning board attorney, Doug Kovatz, is going to give approximately a 1-hour presentation to everyone with regard to municipal land use law in New Jersey. Tonight's meeting is not going to focus on Fairhaven specifically. Tonight's meeting is going to focus on where the jurisdiction comes to the zoning and planning boards to do what they do, specifically in Fairhaven. But the idea is to sort of bring everybody from the 20,000 foot view down to what our boards do in Fairhaven. Once Doug is done with his presentation, we won't interrupt Doug with questions, although I might interrupt him a touch. I'll try not to. We will actually then take a moment for the council, 15 minutes to engage Doug in any questions or comments that they may have with regard to what Doug went through. We will then move to the zoning board and we will engage them in conversation another 15 minutes. And then we will go to the planning board and we will do the same thing. After we've been through that, we will then open this up to members of the public. And if there are any members of the public that have any comments or questions, we'll go through that. Does anybody have any questions about that presentation before we move on to the planning board business for tonight? Good. Seeing none. Susan Gruhl is here, who is our planner. And Susan is going to inform the planning board with regard to an ordinance that's being presented before the board tonight for comment related to affordable housing. Susan?
Hello, everyone. Sounds like you're going to have a wild and crazy night.
I will be very quick. This is a referral of the affordable housing ordinance. It's a very discreet amendment to that ordinance that was passed several months ago, at the end of last year. That really lays out all the details of how do you go about determining the affordable housing, all the regulations and such. The Fair Share Housing Center, which is the advocacy group that we're dealing with affordable housing, had looked at this, delayed, and had determined that they had wanted to have in this ordinance more detail regarding the low and the very low income bedroom split, so that where there is a minor modification is G, new construction, 1, low moderate split and bedroom distribution of affordable housing units, and then it would be small b. It again relates to what the breakdown is if you have so many affordable units, what the bedroom breakdown is, and the very low income breakdown is of those units for purposes of making sure that it's consistent with all the affordable housing regulations. So that's the only part of this ordinance that is proposed to be amended and has been introduced. That is the discrete section of this. So it really is consistent with all the regulations and just refines what you had already adopted. Answer any questions, Todd? Anything else that makes sense?
Yeah, I know that Elena actually has the markup if we want to put it up on the screen. Doug, the reason it's coming back to the planning board is because the ordinance is proposed to be amended and readopted by council, and the process sends it to us for an opportunity to comment before that occurs at the council level, correct?
That's my understanding, and I just want to confirm with Susan that it just barely trips over, the way I read it, a substantive change, because we're designating a couple people, we're tweaking it, but nothing in the modifications that have been made, or at least that requiring the additional reading, make it inconsistent with the master plan or the zoning ordinances and or the ordinances that we previously adopted. Is that correct?
That is correct. It just really, it clarifies parts of the very low income bedroom breakdown piece.
Okay.
You're right, Doug.
Does anyone on the planning board have any questions with regard to the specific changes in the ordinance that are before us? Has everyone had an opportunity to see it? Did it ever get circulated? I'm seeing some head nods. Okay, so I guess, Doug, we don't vote on this, right? We just, there's solicitation of comments, and then you'll write a note to council with regard to the review and comments, if any, from the planning board?
Correct. Whatever comments that the planning board has, as we've said before, we use it as a quick teachable moment. If for some reason the planning board found something inconsistent with the zone plan or master plan or the zoning ordinances, then they would advise mayor and council of that. That wouldn't change the adoption. It would simply change the vote the mayor and council would have to do to pass it. If we find that it is consistent, we usually write a short letter saying that we reviewed it, find it to be consistent, and if there's any additional comments, we usually share those with mayor and council.
All right, great. So if no one has any comments, we can move on to the next part of the agenda, which really should have been the first part of the agenda, which was to welcome Jesse. Jesse, are you there? Oh, there you are.
Mr. Chairman, may I leave your meeting? I would love to listen, but do you need me here any longer?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
No, absolutely. Susan, thank you for coming and explaining the ordinance to us and taking time out of your night. We appreciate it.
thank you. Have a good evening.
So Doug, we have a new board member, Jessie Murray. Welcome.
Hi, guys.
Needs to do her oath.
Jesse, has someone furnished you an oath?
Excuse me?
Has someone given you a copy of your oath?
Yes.
Okay, then I'm going to ask you to pull out your copy. I'm going to do the oath. Ask you to repeat after me, stating your name where appropriate.
Okay, don't have
If
my.
you don't have it handy,
I don't have it handy.
I'll go it extra slow.
Okay.
You all set?
Yeah.
Okay. I state your name.
I, Jessie Murray,
You solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution
do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution
of the United States and the Constitution of the State of New Jersey.
of the United States and the Constitution of New Jersey,
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same
and to the governments established in the United States and in this state,
and in the governments, sorry, here for that,
and the governments established in the United States and in this state,
and the governments established in the United States and this state
under the authority of the people.
under the authority of the people,
That I will faithfully, impartially, and justly perform
that I will faithfully, impartially, and justly inform
the duties of planning board class, of the planning board member according to the best of my abilities.
the duties of planning board to the best of my abilities.
You can either swear or affirm.
I affirm.
Very good. And what I'm going to ask you to do is when you have some time, welcome.
Thank you.
Then what I'm going to ask you to do is to swear, is to sign your oath of office.
Mhm.
Turn that to Judith, please. I'm sorry, Ms. Fuller. And then once that's done and gathered, I'll come in and swear and subscribe them and conform them. Welcome aboard.
Great. Thank you.
Welcome, Jesse. You won't see another meeting like this one, I promise you. So I just want to apologize because I had a miscommunication with Teresa about the running of Zoom. Normally, when Joe runs the meetings, he can move people in and out. I have resisted learning how to do this, and so I can't do it. So we don't have that ability. So I'm going to suggest that people that are going to be up in the Zoom window use the speaker view so we can focus on Doug as Doug gives his presentation. Everyone from the planning board now, you can go ahead and kill your both your microphone and kill your video. And we're going to come over. I'm going to go to speaker view myself. And Doug, let's now dig into the presentation that we've discussed giving.
Could we take care of one other thing, Todd? I think we need to vote on awarding the contract to Doug Kovats. Last month, we appointed him, but we didn't actually vote on awarding the contract.
Doug, is there any reason for us to do that now, or can we just do that next time?
You can do that next month. My contract generally identifies that I serve until someone else is appointed or I'm reappointed. So there's no problems. No changes in the contract from the last time. But
Yeah, let's just roll forward. It's been
let's
very
roll
choppy.
forward.
It's been very choppy, and I take full responsibility for it. But I'd like to bring it back. I thank everybody for showing tonight, and I want to take the opportunity to really extract some value out of the opportunity to talk to everybody about these land use issues. Just to sort of set the stage for Doug, when we start zoning board meetings, it was passed on to us as a tradition, and we always start by reading a statement. And I'll just read to you a portion of that statement so that everybody can understand kind of the reason that we're talking through municipal land use. The zoning board is a separate and independent municipal legal entity, and its limited authority is specifically set forth in the borough ordinances and the New Jersey municipal land use law. We say it all the time. I don't know that everybody actually understands where it comes from, so we're going to learn that tonight. Quasi-judicial in nature, and the members of the board are unpaid volunteers appointed by the mayor and council. Most of us, because we've been appointed, know that. The zoning board does not enact the borough land use laws and regulations. The borough council does that. The zoning board does not enforce the land use laws in the borough of Fairhaven. This is the responsibility of the borough code enforcement officer. We're going to discuss that tonight briefly as well. The board deals with appeals for relief from the requirements of the borough's land use laws and denials by the zoning officer. The balance of it says that people aren't entitled to a variance, but have an obligation to actually to make the proofs required that are set forth in both the borough ordinances and in the statute. And so there's a framework to what we do. And Doug, when I put together some thoughts on how to do this meeting, I thought that the right place to start was with the jurisdiction of the boards. You want to go ahead and sort of lead from here with regard to the MLUL, local ordinances, and the master plan?
Sure. No problem at all. Jurisdiction is always a good place to start. Even though it sounds very lawyerly, it really does set the stage for much of what our land use boards do. And throughout the course of the presentation, there will be times when I refer to the planning board, zoning board. For shorthand, I'll probably be referring to the planning board most of the time. But with regard to our land use boards, sometimes people will say, well, where does municipality get off telling me what I'm going to do with my land? And the short answer is, well, just like a lot of other things, we're governed by laws. And in this instance, the New Jersey Constitution delegates the authority for land use to the legislature. The legislature, in turn, has adopted certain ordinances, and commonly referred to as a collection of ordinances, or collection of statutes rather, known as the Municipal Land Use Law, MLUL, as it's commonly referred to. And within the Municipal Land Use Law, the legislature has said, okay, we're going to allow local municipalities in New Jersey to govern the land use within their boundaries, and in very certain limited circumstances that we're not going to get into this evening, sometimes outside of their own boundaries, but basically saying you're going to be given that authority to govern the use of land within your municipality, provided you do a couple of things. And they're really very, very fundamental. Number one, the mantra of most planning and zoning in New Jersey is that there has to be a plan. So the first thing the legislature said is there has to be a master plan. There's got to be a master plan in which basically the land use in the municipality is identified. And that plan is usually referred to, not usually, but it is referred to as the master plan. And the master plan is basically the planning document for any municipality. Okay? There are really only two mandatory constituent elements of the master plan. And that is you must have some statements of objectives and assumptions upon which the municipality is basing its development on physical, social, economic development. And the second is that you have to have what is known as a land use element. And the land use element basically is a description of how all land is used within the borough. Now, that's different than a zoning map, although in many instances it tends to coincide with a zoning map because it's the basis of your planning. Basically, a land use element identifies all the uses in the municipality, commercial uses, generally where they're located, residential uses, playground areas, all of the constituent things that make up your municipality. And in many instances, you'll have a color coordinated map. We have one in our master plan that basically identifies, okay, these strips here around the main drags, those are all commercial properties. There's some mixed use in there. There's some residential. Outlying there, there's maybe some properties that are developed for religious purposes. There may be other properties developed for residential purposes. Basically, all of those parcels are identified. From there, the other constituent elements are optional. Most municipalities, and as well as Fairhaven, we'll have a zoning map then. We identify basically all of our zoning. Now that we have our land use, we're going to have certain zones. There'll be certain residential zones that will be based on larger parcels of property. We'll have certain commercial areas, and basically set forth what's going on within the municipality. In addition to that, you're going to have your zoning ordinances. And as Todd has already said, the planning board adopts and is sort of the keeper of the master plan. We don't enact ordinances. That's the jurisdiction, if you will, of the governing body. But what the governing body does then is, based upon the master plan, which is sort of the structure of our planning, then designs certain ordinances which puts flesh on the bone, if you will. So that if you have certain bulk requirements for residential areas, how big the lot should be, that they should front on a street, what the side yard setbacks are, what the rear yard setbacks, you're going to find that detail in the zoning ordinances. You'll find the zones identified in the master plan, but you won't necessarily find the bulk requirements or the permitted uses or the non-permitted uses. That will be the flesh on the bone, so to speak, that are listed in our municipal ordinances. So that you go from the Constitution, the municipal land use law, master plan, and our ordinances. That's sort of the overlying area of jurisdiction that we work with as the planning board, and also with the zoning board of adjustment, although there are different functions. But from there, as long as you're looking to do zoning and planning in the borough of Fairhaven, you can look to the master plan, you can look to the zoning ordinances. The other thing that the legislature said, in order for us to continue to have the authority to govern over, or at least make rules over zoning and planning in our municipality, is that we don't allow that master plan to go stale. And by that, I mean, it doesn't just become the master plan that sits up on the shelf and we never look at it again. We are obliged on a periodic basis, at a minimum every 10 years, to re-examine that master plan. And during that re-examination period, we might take a look at our original assumptions that were made 10 years before. We might see if those assumptions are still comport with reality. Have there been changes in our land use law that we have to now address in our master plan, such as we've done stormwater management, we've made adoptions to our master plan as far as re-examinations go. Our Mount Laurel obligations, recently we did those where we made that a part of our constituent element. We're in the process of looking at those ordinances this evening. And periodically make sure that our master plan comports with the dictates of planning and zoning at the state level, county level, and that our master plan, in a sense, is still up to speed, and where we then need to make adjustments to our zoning ordinances, do that in accordance with state statute.
Hey, Doug, let me jump in.
Sure.
So what we've got here is we've got the state constitution, the MLUL, the ordinances that the council actually adopts, and then we have some strings that go all the way back to Trenton. So what we've been granted is something that a lot of people like to refer to as local rules. So in New Jersey, it's different than the way it works in some other states. And some people say it's good, some people say it's bad, but in Fairhaven, we have the ability to regulate what we do in Fairhaven through these series of laws. And we're going to move into how those laws are directly connected between what our obligations are, both to our neighbors and our community, and how those regulations are still tied back to Trenton. And so Doug had mentioned the affordable housing. When issues like affordable housing come up at a state level, the way that they tie the obligations back to the municipalities is through this mechanism. And so they work both with us and nudge us to do the things that they want to see happen. The stormwater regulations is another example of that. So Doug, the next two things that did you cover everything you wanted to cover on jurisdiction?
Not necessarily. I wanted to cover that. And I guess if it wasn't clear, but it sort of dovetails along with what Todd has said. If it isn't clear, let me make it perfectly clear that because we are in either a zoning board of adjustment or a planning board, a creature of statute, we have limited powers. And I want to make that very, very clear. We are not, on the planning board or the zoning board of adjustment, we're not omnipotent. Occasionally I'll get a question from a brand new board member not on this board, but one of the other boards I represent, new planning board member comes on and says, okay, I'm glad I'm on the board, Doug. Just want to ask you a couple of questions. There's a couple signs in town that I'm not really enamored with. I don't really like those signs. And I want to know how we go about, addressing those issues now that I'm on the planning board. And I have to gently, politically explain to the planning board member, you have as much authority as an individual person has. As a member of the planning board, your authority is limited to when you sit with the planning board, and if the planning board has jurisdiction over a matter, and you ultimately have a majority of the board to agree with you, then perhaps your way of thinking can carry the day. But for the most part, we're not a body that goes out and patrols, if you will, the municipality. We are a reactive body, both the zoning board of adjustment and the planning board. And by that, I mean, someone asks us to take a role. Perhaps the municipality asks us to take a look at an ordinance, which we did this evening, and act as the governing body's legislative committee and tell them whether or not that ordinance is consistent with the zone plan and the zoning ordinances and the master plan for the borough. And where it isn't, we identify those things that are not consistent. We don't change that law. We may make recommendations, but the governing body will generally take those into consideration. But all that will do is heighten a vote requirement. If for some reason, in our view, it's not consistent, it just heightens the vote requirement for the adoption for mayor and council. It doesn't veto it. We don't have veto power. With regard to applications, again, we don't go out and say, well, we really think this property really needs to be revamped by the planning board. Instead, the development application comes in, and if for some reason our zoning officer says to us, okay, they need certain relief, the first thing the zoning officer will do is make a determination as to what board it goes to. But I want to make it very, very clear. Even though we may individually think something's a good idea, you're bound to follow the master plan and the zoning ordinances on the planning board. And with regard to the zoning board of adjustment, the zoning board of adjustment, again, is a board of limited jurisdiction. They may have interpretive questions that they respond to, or they may have certain limited areas in which they have the ability to grant variance relief. But again, it's only in response to an application and a matter which is consistent with the zoning ordinances and the master plan. I've covered that part. I'm at the point where I might be talking about different individuals in the borough.
Yeah, so you're leaning forward a little bit in terms of the ordinances essentially establishing the rules in Fairhaven, for example, and the limited responsibility of the zoning board and the planning board with regard to the process of moving applicants through the various bits and pieces. We will discuss with specificity what they do. But the point is that the jurisdiction comes from Trenton. It goes through the council and eventually reaches the board. The board doesn't have the right to do things that are outside of its jurisdiction. And when we speak about some of those details, that'll all come into focus. So Doug, let's take a real 5 minutes and talk about the zoning officer. And then let's take a real 3 minutes and talk about the board secretary's role before we move into the boards themselves.
Okay. Generally speaking, let's take it as, someone wants to develop a parcel of land. They may go to our land use office. And usually what happens is they'll submit an application. There's an application form. There's a checklist, depending on the relief you want, whether it's site plan, major or minor, subdivision, major or minor. Depending on the relief you're seeking, you'll submit your application along with all of those things that are listed in the checkoff list that I refer to that should be included in a completed application. And it lands on the zoning officer's desk. The zoning officer is going to make several determinations. First determination they make is, does it have to go to a board at all? Is this an exempt development? Does it have to go to the planning board? Does it have to go to the zoning board of adjustment? And they make those decisions. Generally, what's an exempt development? Well, again, I don't want to get too far into the reads, but exempt development is defined in our ordinances as something which doesn't have to go before a planning board or a zoning board of adjustment. And the zoning officer will make that call initially. What are the types of things that are like that? Well, if you have a single family residential home and you're going to build it on a conforming lot and you're going to build a conforming residential structure and you don't need any other relief, generally speaking, the zoning board of adjustment officer is going to say, okay, you're ready for the permitting process. The zoning officer may also say, okay, there might be some things here that I need additional information on to make sure I'm making this call correctly. And if there's some need for refinement, you'll work with the zoning officer, get that information. They'll also coordinate with the borough engineer to make sure that those types of things are all in line. And again, I'm not trying to get too far into the weeds for this, but generally when you're talking about an exempt development, you know, if you're going to add an addition to your house and it's otherwise conforming, well, you're not going to have to go before a planning or zoning board. If for some reason it encroaches on a rear yard or side yard setback, well, then you may have to go before one of the boards, depending on the type of relief you need. If you're, you know, doing some interior design work, you know, re-changing the rooms, you know, revamping the kitchen, or, you know, maybe taking down some walls, but you're not changing the footprint of the property, 9 times out of 10, you're not going to need to go before a board. If you're going to add on, you know, a generator or some electrical work or something like those types of things, sort of almost common sense dictates you're not going to have to go through the planning and zoning process in the borough. They're going to be able to grant you that relief, provided you're placing, let's say, if it's an air conditioning unit, not encroaching the side yard setback where it requires a variance. And in that instance, the first thing this officer is going to do is say, okay, you may be an exempt developer. The second thing the zoning officer will do is, all right, you may need some variance relief. And depending on the type of relief that you need, the zoning officer is going to make a determination, again, in coordination with the borough engineer and our board secretary, to advise as to what board you need to go before. So let's take a little bit of time concerning those types of things. The jurisdiction of the planning board.
No, I don't want to go there yet. I don't want to go there. I want
I
to
just
do.
wanted to cover jurisdiction.
I want to go there, but I want to go there when we're going to do the planning board. I want to add just another sort of more simplistic summary of how the zoning officer comes into play. If you want to do something, anything, and you need to pull a permit, everybody knows that they need, if they're going to do construction, to pull a permit. If they're going to open a business, they need to pull a permit. So you're going to go in and you're going to submit to the borough offices, this is what I want to do. The zoning officer is the gatekeeper of what the rules are. And so the zoning officer is essentially, broadly speaking, number one, going to tell you whether or not what you're planning to do is consistent with the ordinances. And if it is, then you don't need any variances. So as long as you're within what the ordinances say, the zoning officer isn't going to send you to the zoning board for a deviation. For a business and for doing things with the operation of a commercial space, there are certain planning requirements that Doug wants to get into, and I'm holding him back, for the planning board. So that's a separate set of processes. So the zoning officer there would direct an applicant in a business situation to a planning board if in fact they need a site plan approval. But that process of getting your permit triggers that zoning officer review and an opportunity to understand where you are inside or outside of what those ordinances require you to do, either as a matter of right, if you're within the ordinances, or with the approval of a board after you've been through that process. I'm sorry, Doug.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Let's spend 3 minutes on the secretary's process, and then we can do the zoning board or the planning board, whichever one you want to do first.
Let's say in this instance, the zoning officer decides, dovetailing with what Todd has said, you know, you're going to need some C variance relief. Looks like you're building something that's permitted in the area. You're building something that is going to be a permitted structure or permitted use. You're going to build a single family residential structure in the single family residential zone. But it looks like you're encroaching on the side yard, encroaching on the rear yard, encroaching on the front, some variance that you need. And in that instance, he's going to say, okay, you're going to need site plan relief with variance relief. It looks like the variance relief that you need is going to all be C variance relief. And since it deals with the site plan and it's C variance relief, I'm going to send you to the planning board. Now, you've given me some preliminary things, but now that I've told you that it's a site plan application with variance relief, you're going to have to give me some additional information based upon the checklist that the borough has developed in order to be determined that you are a completed application. And by way of completed application, that now it's ready to be reviewed by the professionals and it's ready for the planning board. And during that transition period of the zoning officer saying, okay, this is where you've got to go and you have to put in your completed application. At that point, the planning board secretary's role, although the planning board secretary wears many hats, as planning board secretaries do, the planning board secretary is now going to begin to start shepherding that application. Making sure that the right number of copies are made, making sure that the right number of documents that you're obliged to provide in your application process are part of that application, making sure that all of those things are gathered, and then provide you with information that once you are ready to be deemed complete, and usually the planning board secretary is checking with the engineer, again, to make sure that they have all the information they need to review. Planning board secretary is also gathering up what I refer to as the escrows. The escrows are those funds that the planning board secretary will make sure are paid by the applicant to ensure that the reviews by our professionals are funded by the applicant. It's not coming out of the public's monies. It's coming out of the applicant's monies. And there's a fee schedule. Yeah, and the planning board secretary is making sure that that fee schedule, based upon referring it for what is needed from the borough engineer, they fix the value, make sure those escrows are collected, make sure that when you are ready to give your notice, the planning board secretary will give you the list of property owners within 200 feet to give notice to. In addition to that, provide you with the requisite instructions to provide either published notice or to provide published notice in our papers of records, identifying our papers of record, and basically telling you, okay, we're going to give you a date upon which your hearing is going to go before the planning board. And by that date, you will have had to have had sufficient notice to the public in the published newspaper and sufficient notice to the surrounding property owners, giving them an opportunity to have knowledge of your application, the type of relief that you're seeking, and provide them with information that they can participate in a hearing if they wish to do so, to either come out in favor of your application or to object to your application.
So zoning officer is the one that's going to be looking at the materials submitted to the town to figure out what processes need to be followed. When the zoning officer determines that a matter needs to go to a board, he effectively communicates with the board secretary. Board secretary becomes the point of contact. As the application is put together and the process is developing, the planning and zoning board secretary is the face to the public. When you get to the purpose of the meeting, the planning and zoning board secretaries will do the minutes, they will administer the agenda, and they will kind of keep everything on track. Now, Doug, we get to the big issue of the boards. Which board would you like to start with?
I think on our list, we have the zoning board of adjustment. Let's start there.
Cool, thank you.
All right. The zoning board of adjustment. Generally, what jurisdiction does the zoning board of adjustment have? Well, they've got jurisdiction in several areas. Let's say that there's an interpretive question. Let's say the zoning officer says, I think this needs D variance relief. The applicant doesn't agree for some reason. And we often refer to D relief and C1 and C2. Let me step out of this for a second. When we refer to that, we're really shorthanded referring to the statutes concerning variances that are listed in the municipal land use law. And there's also sort of a mimicking of those same statutes in our local ordinances. But basically, D is referring to 40:55D 70, and then subsection D. And there are a couple of different Ds. There's D1, there's D2. There's also C variance relief, and I'll talk a little bit more in depth about those, but those are more bulk requirements. C1 and C2 are generally applicable to bulk requirements. So we're referring in a shorthand way to C1, C2, D. What really is, if we were to cite the entire statute, would be 40:55D-70, subsection C1, subsection C2, subsection C3, or D, subsection D. So a lot of times we're just shorthanding it. Let me go back to now the interpretive question. The Zoning Board of Adjustment, if the applicant says, well, I don't really think I need D variance relief, I think you got this wrong, zoning officer. I think I'm really a permitted use. You're saying I'm not. I think I am. I want to have somebody independent of you, zoning officer, take a look at this and make a determination as to whether or not you are right. In that instance, that interpretive question is going to be heard by the Zoning Board of Adjustment. Is there an interpretation of a zoning ordinance? Let's say we had a lot of these a million years ago, and I'm dating myself. You know, when we first had places like Blockbusters come in, well, nobody had a place where you could rent a video. Nobody had a video store on their list of permitted uses. And let's say your zoning ordinance says something to the effect of, if this is not listed as a permitted use, then it is otherwise deemed a non-permitted use, which puts you into a pretty high standard in a D variance. And you're saying, well, I'm really just sort of a lending library, but it's video. And I don't think I should be having to get a D variance. And you might have asked for the Zoning Board of Adjustment at that time for an interpretive question on what the intent of the ordinance was. Special questions. Occasionally there are special questions. We need not burden it. But again, the zone, as you may begin to gather from my description of the types of things that they're doing, they do more of a trial type setting. The other thing, boards of adjustment, they can exercise what are known as ancillary powers, heavier relief. There's a greater burden of proof, if you will, or more proof that you have to establish under the municipal land use law in order to have the. I'm sorry, you jumped in?
Yeah, we're having some internet issues, and I'm waiting for it to recover, and it hasn't yet. I want to make sure that everybody's following where you are.
Shall I go slower?
Yeah, you're clear now, but your video is behind. Yep. So I just kind of noticed that your bandwidth is low. So hold on one second. Let me take this opportunity, since I've interrupted you, to make sure that everybody's following. So we have the municipal land use law, which basically sends the authority to the local council to set ordinances. Inside of those ordinances are the rules for everybody operating within a jurisdiction with regard to what they want to do. When they submit an application to the borough and the borough zoning officer says your application doesn't conform to the ordinances, they have an opportunity to challenge what's been said. They go to the zoning board. That's the exclusive jurisdiction. They don't agree with what the zoning, how the zoning officer is interpreting, or the actual meaning of a particular ordinance, goes to the zoning board, exclusive jurisdiction. Again, created out of the MLUO. So the zoning board is actually following what's been directed from Trenton of how the zoning board works with the council to answer these questions and serve the public in this manner that is intended to be cohesive with the ordinances, even though what they are doing is not always consistent with the ordinances, hence the variance. Doug, you were just talking about, I think, a D variance jurisdiction and a supermajority. Do you want to try and explain that jurisdictional issue for the zoning board?
Well, generally, in order to garner a D variance. Let's take one of the ones that might be more familiar with most of the folks that are listening. Let's say you want to put a use in a zone that's not permitted in that zone. Let's say you want to put, generally speaking, in Fairhaven, you can have single family and two family houses. Let's say in a single family residential zone, you want to put a two family in. And in that zone, that's not a permitted use. We only want single family there. In that instance, you can go before the zoning board of adjustments. Assume you're otherwise conforming. You meet your side yard, you meet your rear yard, you meet your front and backyard setbacks. But you want to say, look, I want to allow this two family use in the single family zone, and I think I should be allowed to do that. And in that instance, you have the burden then to demonstrate that you're entitled to that relief. And I'll get more into the standards of that relief in a little bit. But you have an opportunity to do two things in that hearing. Let's say, number one, you decided zoning board of adjustment, zoning officer, I don't think you got this question right. I think technically a two family should be permitted in this zone. So I want an interpretive question. And in the alternative, I also want to get relief. If I'm wrong, I don't want to come back again. My second issue is going to be, I'd also like, if I'm deemed to be wrong by the zoning board of adjustment, I'd like to get a use variance from the board of adjustments. And go forward and have that entire matter heard before the zoning board of adjustment. And the applicant would be permitted to do that. However, they have to garner what is known as, a supermajority. Generally speaking, our zoning board of adjustment consists of 7 members. Okay, they're going to have to get 5 votes in that instance in order to be entitled to that relief. I say we have 7 members in Fairhaven. We also have 2 alternates, but 7 members are voting. And in order to garner that relief, they're going to have to get 5 positive votes to do that. Okay. That's what Todd is referring to when he says the supermajority. The applicant has the entire burden, and they have the burden to demonstrate that they're entitled to that relief. And I'll get to the standards for that relief in a little bit. The other thing that goes one way to the zoning board of adjustment, but does not go back to the planning board. The zoning board of adjustment can also, on a question like that, let's say it was a use variance. Skip the issue with the interpretive question from the zoning officer just to make this example helpful, but to carry it through. Let's say you want to say, I want a use variance to put this 2 family in the single family zone. And by the way, I'm not going to meet the front yard setback. I'm going to be a little bit short. I'm going to be a little bit closer to the street in order to put this in. In that instance, the applicants can say, I'd like 2 types of relief. I'd like the D variance relief, which is the heavier relief. And since I'm going before the zoning board of adjustment, I'd like the zoning board of adjustment to exercise its ancillary jurisdiction. If you agree that I can put this in and get the D variance relief, I'd like you to also go forward and give me what would otherwise be C variance relief similar to a site plan to allow me to encroach into the front yard. In that instance, rather than make the applicant go between 2 separate boards, since the D variance relief is the heavier relief, they're going to allow the applicant to make that application and get the use relief. If they're successful, the zoning board of adjustment can then decide whether or not they're going to grant the C variance relief in that instance. It's entirely possible that the zoning board of adjustment could say, you know what, we agree. We're going to give you the use variance, but we're not going to grant you the setback. We want you to conform to the setback. And in that instance, the applicant could build the 2 family, but it would have to build that 2 family on the conforming to the front yard setback requirements. It doesn't work the other way though. If you have a site plan before the planning board and you're asking for C variance relief, we can't ever exercise D variance relief as the planning board. Let me spend a little more time about the zoning board, or at least a little more time with the zoning board. So the zoning board acts as a trial type setting. Usually it's doing interpretive questions. As I said before, they are 7 members, and in the borough of Fairhaven, they have 2 alternates. Generally speaking, the members' terms are 4 years in length. They are in our municipality, appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the council. That's governed by ordinance under the municipal land use law. That's what our ordinance says in Fairhaven. This is going to be one of those times where we're going to talk about specifically Fairhaven. So, and they are 4-year terms. Now, initially, when the municipal land use law first came into being, they strongly recommended and encouraged you to do something along a staggered term, so that so many of the first and your very, very first zoning board of adjustment members, not all of them had 4-year terms. They sort of gave some 2-year terms, some 3-year terms, some 4-year terms. And the reason for that was then, as that particular seat became up, if you will, we weren't having a wholesale change of the zoning board of adjustment folks. They serve their entire term as long as they otherwise are qualified. Usually otherwise qualified means that they are members of the public and that they are residents of the borough of Fairhaven. Again, you can have as many as up to 4 alternates on a board. However, that again is left to mayor and council to decide whether or not they want to have that many. In this instance, you must have the requisite number of 7. In this instance, no more than 4, and we've chosen 2 alternates for the board. Anything you wanted to add on to that, Todd?
So I want to amplify that what the zoning board is doing, as Doug describes these situations, is evaluating where an applicant can deviate from the ordinances that have been written by council. I think it's very important to understand that each time the zoning board is being asked to evaluate one of these situations, it is either interpreting what the zoning officer has said and how he interprets the ordinances, or whether or not the ordinances should apply to the applicant under a particular set of circumstances. Doug, I think one of the things that we lost a little bit when we shot into the zoning board is some of the basic decisions about the zoning officer makes about where the applications go. Can you try and just pull back a little bit and do a little top-down sort of planning board in this case, zoning board in that case, to explain to people how the zoning officer funnels them in the 2 different directions?
Yeah, there are any number of charts that you can look to. And a lot of times what they do is they give you a series of questions that the zoning officer will ask in order to determine which jurisdiction or which board has jurisdiction. Again, I don't want to get too far into the reads for this, but let's give you some handhelds. If you're talking about straight site plan, no D variance relief. It's a permitted use. It's a permitted structure. If it's straight site plan or subdivision, site plan is, let's say you're not an exempt development, you need to have site plan relief because you're having to qualify for site plan, you need relief, you need to have the planning board take a look at your site plan and make sure it's conforming, or if you need variance relief, that's going to be generally C variance relief, that's going to go before the planning board. Subdivision, that means you're going to take either major or minor. Basically, a minor subdivision is division of a parcel of land, no more than 3 lots. That's 2 plus the original 1. If it's greater than that number of lots, then it's going to be a major subdivision. And in that instance, you're going to be obliged to provide a little more information by way of your checklist than you would for a minor subdivision. So subdivision, site plan, generally those are the issues that are going to go before the planning board. And other issues that the planning board will deal with. Planning board will deal with issues such as, let's say it goes before the zoning board adjustment, and it's an interpretive, or excuse me, let's say mayor and council say, we'd like the planning board to interpret this ordinance that has something to do with development. Planning board will act on that. Usually the zoning officer probably isn't going to be handling that. That will come to us directly from mayor and council. But usually what you're doing is there's a series of questions, is this subdivision? Is it site plan? Is it a capital improvement? If you go through that series of questions, usually what you're coming up with is a determination then as to generally which board is going to have it. And then if it's C variance relief, no D variance relief, it's going to go before the planning board. If it is D variance relief, it's going to go before the zoning board of adjustment. They can review the site plan, they can review the subdivision if there is D variance relief involved.
Yes. Yeah, so the zoning board is going to hear any challenge to a denial by the zoning officer. They're going to listen to any interpretation or appeal with regard to an ordinance itself. And the zoning board has exclusive jurisdiction with regard to a D variance. I'm going to pull back a little bit further. There's only two kinds of variances. There's either a C or a D. They come out of the MLUL. And Doug gave you the citation and would be happy to write it down if you want the citation to go look it up. But again, the MLUL explains to us when these boards can effectively trump what the council's ordinances are. So if it's a D variance, only the zoning board can hear it. So while a site plan and a subdivision have primary jurisdiction of the planning board, that's the first place you think to send it. If it involves a D, it goes right over to the zoning board. And the zoning board recently had such a thing, which is very typical of the planning board, but the zoning board heard it, a site plan on River Road, because it involved that D variance. The C variances that we've referenced have concurrent jurisdiction between the planning and the zoning board. So the zoning board will typically hear the house cases where you want to do an addition and there's a violation of the bulk standards, a setback or a square footage number. Those typically will go to the zoning board unless they involve a site plan. And so that's why those single family home applications all go to the zoning board. And that's why all the zoning board members are so busy right now. The site plan stuff tends to be more of the commercial, more extensive development. Doug mentions a minor and a major subdivision. Like a major subdivision, is it more than 4 lots, Doug?
Well, it's 4 lots and more.
So we don't even have those in Fairhaven. I mean, I don't even know when we've ever seen. I mean, decades ago we did, obviously we were developed at one time, but we only see minor subdivisions now. Okay.
Yeah, again, there's not going to be a test on this, but let me give you a shorthand sort of synopsis of what we've both been saying to try to make it clear. Something lands on the zoning board of adjustment, on the zoning officer's desk. Does it involve a use that's not permitted in the zone? Does it involve a principal structure that's not permitted in the zone? Does it involve an expansion of a pre-existing non-conforming use? Does it involve an increase in floor area ratio? I won't address the conditional use standard. That'll get us too far into the weeds. Does it involve an increase above permitted density? Does it involve the height of a principal structure which exceeds the permitted use by either 10 feet or 10% of the maximum height? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, you're going to the zoning board of adjustment.
Because Doug just listed all the D variances. The C variances are the basic bulk variances. I want to exceed the setback. I want the square footage. And then Doug will explain the difference between a C1 and a C2. They're different types of granting relief, but they're basically about bulk. All those things that Doug just listed, I want to put something that's not supposed to be in this zone, that the council's decided where everything's going. If you believe that you should put it here, even though the zoning doesn't say so, then you're not only going to the zoning board, it's a D variance, and it requires a supermajority of the board. So that's 5 out of 7 votes. But again, the purpose of tonight is to understand why, right? It goes all the way back to the Constitution, the MLUL, the authority given to our council members that we vote for to establish these rules. And who is the zoning board to say otherwise? So that's the reason it's called a D. That's the reason it requires 5 out of 7 affirmative votes. And that's the reason that it's hard to get.
And the counter to that, dovetailing very nicely in the Todd and Doug show here, the counter to that is if the answer to all those questions are, no, it doesn't involve any of those things, but you still need a variance, you are dealing with C variance relief and you're going before the planning board. Okay? If you still need that variance relief, because you're going to be dealing with site plan or subdivision, and you're going to be going before the planning board. So we talked about the number of members on the zoning board of adjustment. We talked about the number of alternates. We talked about the fact that the members on the zoning board of adjustment are basically appointed by the mayor and approved by council. Okay. Well, what about the planning board?
Before you go there, Doug,
Okay.
I did see a hand raised and I just want to repeat for the audience. We're going to keep going through this. Doug, just so you know, we're at 8:35. We started at 7:50, so we're 45 minutes in. We've got between 20 and 30 minutes from here. Once we're done with the presentation, we're going to do questions from the board members and the council, and then we're going to open it up for public questions at the end. So we won't be taking questions for a little bit yet, but please jot them down and we can go back on anything. It wouldn't be possible to respond to questions in real time.
Okay. Here we go. Planning board. Generally speaking, and again, thumbnail, if you're dealing with site plan, subdivision relief, generally it's going before the planning board. Let me stop here for a second. And sometimes, because we did have this issue not too long ago, before I get to the constituent members of the planning board, consistent with the concept of the exempt development, there's also notice. And even though something may be coming before a board, zoning officer will also determine, usually in coordination with the planning board secretary, if the application is going to require the applicant to give notice. And one of the things that we have with regard to notice that came up not too long ago was we had someone who wanted to take an oversized lot in the borough, subdivide it into 2 conforming lots. They were not seeking site plan. In other words, they weren't showing us pretty pictures of buildings. They were saying, I want to take 1 lot into 2. These are conforming lots, and I can demonstrate that by putting in sort of a footprint, that I'm not going to need any other variance relief. I'm not going to need the side yard, rear yard, front yard, and I'm going to build a conforming structure in the zone. In that instance, while that individual, because it involved 1 lot into 2, it's a minor subdivision, but no other relief is required, that applicant was not obliged to provide notice to 200 feet around for individuals. They could simply come before the planning board and get that relief. That again is by municipal land use law and interpretation of municipal land use law by our courts. And it's consistent with our zoning. We're not requiring that individual to give notice. So sometimes people will say, well, I saw them subdivide this property. How come I didn't hear about it? And the answer for that is, in many instances, again, since we're creatures of ordinance and statute and only authority granted to us by legislature, we can't graft additional notice requirements on that applicant. That applicant is entitled to that relief, provided they are otherwise conforming. It's a conforming lot and they can demonstrate or they commit to building something that's conforming. And this is a good side note. The individual relief that is granted to any applicant, whether it is D variance relief before the zoning board of adjustment, C variance relief before the planning board, site plan, subdivision, the relief that is granted, even though it's granted to the applicant and the owner or the owner of the property, that relief, once granted, runs with the land. It is not individual to the applicant who has made the application. And by that, I mean, if we grant subdivision relief to a property owner, they can turn around and sell that property as subdivided, and that subdivision will be as good for the first owner who made the application and got the relief as it is for the subsequent purchaser. They're allowed to rely upon that, and they're allowed to, as long as that subdivision is then perfected according to law. In other words, they do what they're required to make sure that the subdivision is perfected by way of meets and bounds and confirming that within the deed. That property is now going to be subdivided on a go-forward basis, and subsequent owners can rely upon that. That's a little bit of a digression. Let me jump into the planning board.
Doug, I want to amplify that point. So when we talked about the zoning board, we talked about how the zoning board was giving variances and making interpretations and had to make judgments and decisions. Some of the things that go before the planning board, and we can talk about some of the other municipal things that are done to support the council, very unique from the zoning board. But some of the things, including subdivision, can come in as a site plan where if the application conforms to the ordinances, you're before the planning board. But there is no discretion at the planning board level to do more than review the application and review the design criteria. And if there's no variance that's required, then you're entitled to something as a matter of right, we call it. So if I have a lot that is appropriately two based on the ordinances, the planning board doesn't have the right to say, no, we prefer it as one. What the planning board's job is to review perhaps the way that the trees are going to come down, where the houses will be sited on the lot, other issues related to a site plan, which Doug can talk more about. But the discretion of the planning board is not to say yes or no, because the conformity to the ordinances is what's paramount. And so it's important to understand that just because it's before a board doesn't necessarily give the planning board in particular an opportunity to deny an applicant what they're looking to do. But the MLUL requires that the planning board have an opportunity to see it and hear it at a meeting and go through it. I think maybe a little bit about some site plan stuff, Doug, in terms of, I don't know if you were going there, I apologize. Wherever you were going.
First, what I want to do is tell you who's on the board, and then we can talk about site plan.
Great.
Who's on the board? Unlike the zoning board of adjustment, we have some different classifications that are referred to as classes. There are some, basically the planning board in the borough of Fairhaven consists of 9 members and 2 alternates. But unlike the zoning board of adjustment, we have different groups of members. We have a class 1 member, and that's the mayor. Now that's either the mayor or the mayor has the opportunity to designate an individual. The statute gives fairly broad discretion for the mayor to do that. The only limitation is that person is designated, serves as the mayor's designee based upon the mayor's pleasure. The mayor could technically say, okay, you're going to be my designee for this year, but I'm not necessarily going to, even though I'm going to be mayor next year, if they are mayor next year, I may not have you be my designee for the following year. Basically, if you're the designee, you are sort of like the length of your term is as long as the mayor is the mayor, and or the mayor decides that you should continue to be the designee. The only catch with the designee is that if the mayor does decide to come to a meeting and they do have a designee, well, then the designee has to step down and the mayor sits on the dais then. But 2 members. These are officials of the municipality, and they are generally serve 1 year. Okay, and this is again a class 2. Class 2 member. It can be any official of the mayor. There is a little bit of getting into the reeds with that with regard to the environmental commission, depending on what the other constituent members are. But basically, think of it as an official of the borough, an employee of the borough, designated by mayor and council. Class 3 member. The class 3 member is a member of the borough council selected by the borough council. All right. The class 4 members are citizens who do not hold office or position who do not hold office or are an employee of the municipality. And there are 6 members appointed by the mayor. Okay. As you're beginning to see the structure of these things, and their term, the class 1 member, the class 2 member, and the class 3 member are all 1-year terms. The class 4 members are all 4-year terms. So you're beginning to see some of the structure here, and it was deliberate by the legislature that the majority of the constituent members would not necessarily be part of the governing body, if you will. Governing body takes a certain role with regard to the zoning board of adjustment, but they are limited and in a sense outnumbered, if you will, by the constituent members of the class 4 members. And we also have 2 alternates, which are also have to qualify as class 4 members. I know that that's a lot of legalese there, but basically mayor gets to pick one, governing body gets to pick one. There's an official from the borough, so there's 3, and then the other 6 constituent members are citizens, again, residential requirements, and they serve for the length of their 4-year term.
And I think the importance of that, Doug, to identify for the audience is that the planning board's role in town is very different. And so, the council sending to us an ordinance to review and comment on is something the zoning board would never do. And so the makeup of the board is intended to be thoughtful as to the input for the various things that the planning board is supposed to do to assist the council with regard to its business.
All right. And the areas that the planning board exercises jurisdiction, we've already touched on a couple of those. Basically, I like to say that the planning board is the keeper of the master plan. It is the planning board which adopts the master plan. It is the planning board which conducts the re-examination of the master plan, and then holds the public hearings and adopts those things. And it is then contingent upon mayor and council to develop the appropriate ordinances. But there's sort of a symbiotic relationship there. Again, with regard to the master plan, we adopt it, but in many instances, we are looking towards the zoning ordinances and zone plans, what's still effective, what isn't effective, what do we want to continue. And it's a good thing to talk about some of the Mount Laurel housing in that instance. Here was something that was a legislative that if we did not adopt something and make it a part of our ordinances, we would lose our ability to regulate where that housing, though we were obliged to provide for it, where that housing would fit within our municipality. And in fact, that was a fairly long process of deciding where it would fit. And then once we decided where it would fit, to make that part of one of the constituent elements of our master plan. Part of it did not too long ago was once those issues of where the housing was going to be, that it was a realistic development plan, that it could be accommodated for in the borough, was to make that part of our master plan. Now what we're doing is the constituent ordinances that are associated with that to sort of put flesh on the bone as to how we're now going to operate and provide for that within our land use ordinances.
But let me amplify that point. I'm sorry to keep interrupting you. I just want to make sure that I'm connecting the dots, as I think they need to be connected for people to understand, especially with affordable housing being such an issue in town right now. Because our authority to control our own zoning is essentially handed to us through Trenton and the MLUO. They are feeding to us the requirements that we need to meet as those requirements change over time. And so with affordable housing, what broadly happened was there was a court decision that decided that all towns needed to provide adequate zoning to permit housing types of all types. So they were shying away from the idea that some towns had the affordable housing and other towns did not. They would adopt 10-acre zoning where you couldn't put anything other than a single family home, which necessarily lends itself to something other than affordable housing. And the hammer that is hanging over all of us as we work through those issues is that if we don't satisfy the state and the court specifically with regard to our obligations in Fairhaven, what they have the ability to do is to remove our right to zone. So where all of this comes together is that we can do it all on our own until we mess up. And if we mess up, we lose the opportunity to do it on our own. And then it's done by an outside entity. And I guess for affordable housing, it's the court, right? That they would implement zoning, sort of corrective zoning, as punishment if you don't do it on your own. And so the borough has been very much involved in that. And those connections are really important because it's not always understood that there are strings that are being pulled outside of Fairhaven that are directing the council and the boards in Fairhaven to do what the state has decided is important for each town to do.
I think we're at a point where we can discuss. I want to do another encapsulation, if I will. We've been talking about a lot of things. We've been talking about the master plan. We've been talking about the ordinances. We've been talking about the reexamination report. We've been talking about, the reexamination report. We've been talking about this adoption of the fair share housing. We're going to get into and start beginning to discuss variance relief. And occasionally, you will hear me refer to, that there have to be special reasons to grant this relief. We're going to talk about the burdens of the applicant. I'm going to suggest to you that special reasons, in many instances, if an applicant in the course of trying to bear their burden, if they have an obligation to show special reasons, they can look to the purposes of the municipal law, land use law. They can look to the master plan where we've stated our objectives and assumptions and specific goals within our master plan. They can look to those goals as they have changed in our reexamination report. And if they can tie it into one of those goals or objectives, tie it into the master plan, tie it into the municipal land use law, tie it into our zoning ordinances and say, look, right here, Fairhaven, in your master plan, in addition to the standard items that are generally found within the municipal land use law, you have an additional one that talks about preserving the existing residential neighborhoods and reinforcing residential small town character with a central business district. My application, even though it's technically non-conforming, you got to admit, I'm showing you that I can do that. And if you can tie it into that type of a use, that's where you're going to find some of your special reasons. Before I give you that sort of head note first to highlight that for you, let's talk about the difference variance relief, and that will come, I hope, a little bit clearer as we go forward. Let's talk about C variance relief. C1, again, 40, 55D, 70, C1. What is that relief? It's commonly referred to as hardship relief. Okay? If it's going to be strictly site plan, no D variance relief involved. It's going to be relief at the site plan or subdivision. It's going to be something that the planning board is going to do or handle. And generally, under the C1 criteria, the hardship is based upon something that's unique or exceptional, some characteristic of the property that results in an undue hardship on the applicant. See if I can make that clear by way of an example. In one of the other municipalities that I do planning board work for, there are properties that back on a river, and the front of that property is a road. And depending on where you are in the bend of that road, the lots are deeper, shorter, 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 till they have a constituent lot, clearly a permitted lot. It fronts on a street, but unless you built a house, which it would be possible to build a house, but it wouldn't be practical to build that house because at the back side of it, you couldn't get your rear yard setback. If you got your front yard setback and you did your side yard setbacks, you really were coming up across the bulkhead just about, except for a few short feet. In that instance, because it was a pre-existing lot, because it was something that you couldn't combine it with another lot, That applicant had a very good opportunity to make a case to say, look, the only person I'm going to be taking from, if you will, is myself. And if the idea to have a rear yard is to give some area of light, air, and not make it too congested, well, if you allow me to go almost up to the bulkhead, you got the clear river. I don't own it, but you got all, in a sense, the land that you would need. I could meet the front yard, I could meet the side yard, but if I do those things, I want to be able to get C variance relief to make a shorter rear yard. And instead of having 35 feet setback from my property line, I'd like to build it so it's only 15 feet. From the street, it's going to look like every other property. The only people that are going to really notice that I'm not meeting the side yard, or excuse me, the rear yard setback are people along the river. And if I do this right, because it's on a curve, I can still create, with this setback that I have, a good view to my property owner. There was no one to their, in a sense, there was no one to their north. There was only one property owner to their south. I can create so that they still have the appropriate vista. It'll be a little bit shorter, but they can still have an appropriate vista looking out. I'm not going to block their view towards the water. And in that instance, that applicant carried the day because it was the situation was unique based upon where the river was situated, where the road was situated, the fact that there was an existing lot, and they were able to carry the day and say, look, this is classic C variance relief. I didn't create this, and there's a hardship. In order for me to make a functional living house, I should be able to do this, and they were granted that relief. So basically, the constituent elements of a C1 is that you're going to show by exceptional narrowness, shallowness, or the shape of a specific property. Sometimes you have that where different roads converge. Instead of having, four sides, maybe you have a triangle. And in that instance, you have to do some strange configuration because you technically have two front yards, and you have to designate one as a rear yard. And you may be able to carry the day and say, look, we all agree, I've got the requisite area. I just don't have enough for a side yard or front yard setback because of the unusual narrowness or shallowness of the lot. Or it can be because of topographic conditions. Let's say something suddenly drops off in the back. We don't necessarily have that in Fairhaven, but in some of our municipalities up in the Highlands, suddenly something just drops off in the back. And because of that unique characteristic, they may be able to carry the day as to the hardship. And that basically, it's not an impossible burden, but would result in practical difficulties, and that the exceptional undue hardship, practical difficulties that create a hardship in conforming to the zone plan and zoning ordinances. The applicant has what is commonly referred to as the positive and negative criteria. The positive criteria is to show what that narrowness is, what that uniqueness is, what the physical characteristic is. And as the applicant I was describing to you before was able to demonstrate, was that you can give me this relief without a substantial detriment to the public good. And it's really, if you do this, because it's unique and because I'm allowing for that vista, it's not really going to impair the intent and purposes of your zone plan or your zoning ordinances. You're still going to have light and air. I'm still going to be separated on either side by my property owners. I'm still going to be front yard setback so that the street alignment goes pretty good. And in that instance, I'm going to be able to show the unique characteristic and demonstrate that I'm not going to hurt your zone plan or zoning ordinance. And with that, you can carry the day. But it's a burden on the applicant to be able to prove that positive and negative criteria. That's the C1.
So Doug, just to tease that out further, so the council is going to adopt ordinances, they're going to adopt a zone plan. And so within, say, an R10 zone, everybody's going to have the same setbacks, side yard, rear, and front, but each lot is unique. And so what Doug has just described is a situation where when you lay that zoning ordinance on top of a particular lot, that particular lot doesn't fit in there the way that it should. And so as a result, that hardship argument essentially is, look, this situation doesn't work here. it may make sense in the zone as a whole, but because of something unique about this particular property, and Doug, also the structure itself, right?
Sorry, yes. If there are pre-existing structures on the lot.
Right. So the hardship in either the land where it doesn't work because of some strange configuration or topography, or I'm doing a renovation, I'm trying to work with this structure, and the hardship is that I'm trying to be efficient about what I'm doing. So yes, it may be too close to the side yard, but you need to be mindful of the fact that I don't have enough money to tear it down and start over. So you're basing that C1 variance on the idea that you're creating a very unique plan for that particular lot and that particular proposed development. And that's what that C1 is.
As you can well imagine, we did have a C variance pretty early on in our land use history in New Jersey. But you can see that based upon the C1 criteria, it's fairly difficult to make that hardship argument. In many instances, people can't really proceed with a hardship. And as things progressed, as it often is the case, the law began to change. And suddenly, well, I shouldn't say suddenly, over time, we had developed what is now known as the C2 variance. They didn't really stretch very far to get the name of it. Again, it's 4055D. You have C1 as the hardship. C2 is commonly what's referred to as the flexible C. And in this instance, the focus of the C2 is not necessarily on the characteristics of the land, but it's that perhaps the applicant is coming up with something that while it is technically a permitted use, but they want to go to a density or something along those lines, which even though there's a deviation, it's the characteristics of the land that lend itself to provide with a different development application and or a different proposal that will be in keeping with the zone plan and zoning ordinance. That's a mouthful, but by definition, the C2 variance can be granted when the applicant can demonstrate that the actual benefit to the community, that there will be something beyond simply a hardship, but will help development regulations and zoning ordinances. So it's not that merely the owner's interest is advanced, it's that they're providing something that will also advance the zone plan and zoning ordinance. Not too long ago, again, I had a pretty good example of this in which the applicant was proposing to provide, they were already a pre-existing non-conforming use. This was on a seashore community where on relatively small lots, there were multiple housing, multiple parcels, single parcel, multiple dwelling units on the lot. They'd been grandfathered in, as we've seen in some seashore communities, many years ago, single lot. The lot was probably an R50 lot, 50 feet of frontage, 100 foot of depth, upon which there were what were commonly referred to back in the day as summer cottages. There were 4 of them because under the present zoning, they did not allow multiple dwelling units on the single family residential zone. The applicant had allowed many of them to fall into disrepair because it wasn't worth their while to do that anymore. And as I said, there were 4. And what the applicant ultimately came and said, look, I've got a couple of these parcels around me. Here's what I propose to do. You got 4 separate dwelling units. And anytime I want to add to these things or do this, you guys make me come in because it's a non-permitted use. We always go through the question of whether or not it's expansion of a non-conforming use. work with me a little bit. I know you don't want these things to continue to exist, but I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to tear down all four, if you allow me to do that. And what I would like an opportunity to do, meet front yard, side yard, rear yard setbacks. But what I'd like to do is make it a two-family. Now, I know you don't allow two families in the zone, but I will design this property in such a way that, I'll have an accessory garage structure that'll provide for adequate parking for the number of bedroom units I'll put in this. I won't exceed the height. I won't exceed the floor area ratio. What I want to do, quite frankly, is sort of what's commonly referred to as a mother-daughter. I want to have substantially one big residential units with sort of like an apartment for, if you want it deed restricted, I can deed restrict it. But what I'd really like it is to be a little bit of an income property where a single person can come in, live in that location, have a sort of separate entrance. But for all intent and purposes, unless you really studied the property, you're not going to know it's a two-family. And the reason I want to do this is I know you don't like these 4 units that I have on there. This will act as a nice transition. And if you want, I'll guarantee a rent restriction that'll be consistent with what you're trying to do for your Mount Laurel housing, so that will not only benefit, that doesn't just necessarily benefit me. This will bring it more in line with the zoning that you want to see. It's not perfect, but more in line with the zoning that you want to see, and you'll get the benefit of a Mount Laurel housing unit. Look at your special reasons in your Mount Laurel. I'm conforming that. I'm giving you that opportunity. I'm going to have it rent restricted for that period of time. And I'm going to put up a nice property that everyone will like, and perhaps it will encourage other people to do the same. And in that instance, the applicant was able to demonstrate, look, this is not only just for my benefit, this helps you out with your Mount Laurel obligations, and it eliminates these 4 dilapidated structures and brings it more in conformance with the zoning. And in that instance, I thought that was a pretty good example of a C2, because there was absolutely nothing about the property that precluded him from tearing everything down and putting up a single family residential structure. It just wasn't in necessarily his economic interest to do that. And this allowed this to move along.
What's really interesting about that, Doug, is, you don't have a lot of instances where you can really understand how that flexible C is going to trump the council's right to zone and to create these standards for every single lot. But Doug's example gives you an opportunity to see where this is created because sometimes looking at an individual lot as a one-off like this makes sense. But always we need to be mindful that you're asking for the board, planning or zoning in that case, to make a decision that's contrary to what the zoning ordinances say they're permitted to do. So it's a big deal. Doug, we touched on Cs. I don't want to go back. I'm sorry, we touched on Ds. I don't want to go back to that. I want to wrap up in just a couple of minutes. Can we just make sure that we've covered broadly the jurisdiction of the planning board? Because the planning board gets some weird things. Can we just go through some of that stuff?
Sure. What does the planning board do? As I said before, the planning board, they can handle bulk variances where C variances, C1 variances, where they're associated with a site plan or subdivision. They don't have any jurisdiction with regard to use variances. They have jurisdiction with regard to site plan approvals, as long as there's no D variance involved. They have jurisdiction with regard to interpretive issues by way, strike that, not interpretive issues, but by way of taking a look at those issues involving land use ordinances. In that instance, as we did this evening, we act sort of as the mayor and council's legislative committee to tell them, we're looking at the zoning, sure, look at the development ordinance, and we will tell you whether or not this is in conformance with the zoning plan, zoning ordinances, municipal land use law, the master plan, and where it deviates, to identify those deviations, so that the mayor and council want to adjust that so it's more in conformity with that, they can do that. We have charge of the master plan, subdivision control, site plan review. We are in charge technically of the official maps pursuant to those constituent maps which are in the municipal, in the master plan, the land use element, the zoning. We adopt those maps as part of the master plan. We also review capital improvement projects, so that anytime that there's going to be public money spent for a public purpose, the planning board reviews the capital review. So recently, or in any municipality where a school board of education is proposing to add an addition or to place some type of an improvement that meets within the jurisdiction of the planning board, one of the elements that is in not only Title 18A, which governs school boards of education, but also within the municipal land use law, is that there has to be a presentation by the Board of Education before the planning board to advise them of what they are doing. Now, again, they advise us of what they are doing. We can make certain recommendations to them. We don't technically have jurisdiction over that application. Technically, the Board of Education has their own planning board within the Bureau of Facilities Review in the Commission and Department of Education. But one of the checkoffs for the Department of Education is to say, did you go for capital review before the planning board? And if we have particular concerns, let's say there's a concern that you're going to now reconfigure your parking lot and your bus traffic is going to come in a way that we think maybe not good for the overall circulation of that area in the residential zone where the school exists. We can't deny them their ability to make that improvement, but we can bring those concerns to the Commissioner of Education and the Department of Facilities Review. And I have personal experience in representing school boards. Those entities take very seriously the comments of the planning board, and where they can encourage the Board of Education to relook at their properties and rework with us to do that, they will do so.
Doug, 2 minutes. Let's just talk about a change of use site plan application. So, an applicant is a permitted use. There's no D variance at issue. They get sent, the zoning officer sends them to the planning board for a site plan. Assuming they don't need any variances, what's the purpose of sending that matter to the planning board? What's that process supposed to look like?
If it is, let's take a change in use. Usually from one constituent use, let's say you're going from restaurant to restaurant. Usually, and I think we get a buy as an exempt development with regard to that, unless something about that restaurant will change or impact upon what I refer to as the original site plan. Let me explain. You're going to always go before the planning board for a change in use where it is one use that is different than another use, where the new use has a greater impact upon the property. Again, even if you're not changing the footprint of the property, let's say you're going from a two-chair barbershop to a pizzeria. Pizzeria that's going to have tables, that's going to have service to those tables, that's going to have takeout, that's going to have a variety of things. The way our ordinances are designed, we're going to come before for the change in use in that instance to make sure that there's adequate parking, that there's adequate trash collection, there's adequate circulation, assuming again that it is a permitted use, that it's a commercial use is permitted in that area. we're going to want to take a look at that to make sure that the impact of the new use is consistent with our zone plan and zoning ordinances. If you go from, say, like a 2-chair barbershop, you can figure, okay, at any given point in time, there's probably only be, two stylists or 2 haircutters, and 2 people in the chairs, and maybe 2 people waiting. So the total parking requirement would be based upon probably square footage. And if they can demonstrate that their off-street parking requirement meets the needs, that's fine. Now, if you suddenly go from that type of a use to, say, 4 tables, additional workers behind the counter, where you're going to need to provide parking, we have an opportunity to take a look at that and tell them, look, if that result in the change in use, the way our ordinance are structured, requires more than 5 more parking spaces, they may have to come before us for an entire site plan to do those types of things. Conforming use to conforming use, no change in use, one restaurant to another restaurant. You're going to find that under our ordinances, unless there is something that triggers parking or some other element in the zoning officer's mind that requires it to go for full site plan, then they're usually going to be able to go forward without much other than to demonstrate that this is a consistent use and it doesn't burden. Your ordinance specifically state that where the use can be demonstrated that it is going to be a lesser burden than the existing use, they don't need any approval and it can be an exempt development.
Right. So
Covers the realm.
So at the zoning officer level, the zoning officer is making a determination as to whether or not it needs to go to a board at all. One of the things that Doug's mentioned a number of times is the exempt development ordinance. That gives the zoning officer an opportunity to say, we don't need a site plan here. And that ordinance has got a lot of details to it. But sometimes the zoning officer uses that authority to avoid sending a matter for a site plan. When he can't or he doesn't do that, it goes to the planning board to review. Now, where variances are at issue, given the application, then there are things that need to be proven and there needs to be relief granted. But where there are not variances that need to be granted, there's a process of overseeing how they are going to work through what it is that they propose to do. There's a hearing of it, there's a discussion of it. But when there isn't a variance or there isn't the need for the board to grant some exception, the process is largely about working through design standards and trying to make sure that the layout is right and that they've done the best they can do, weighing the fact that the council has already adopted ordinances that say that this use is permitted within this zone. So to wrap up this portion of it, what I really thought the benefit of tonight would be was for people to understand a little bit better where the authority of these boards comes from, how the planning and the zoning board are integrated into the local government, and where council's responsibility is in terms of appointing members to these boards and in terms of putting together the ordinances that are really the driver of what we do in town, and where the boards are granting exceptions, where they have authority and where they don't. I hope that this has been useful. I know that it's very deep and it's very technical. I'm going to switch off my speaker view, go back to gallery view. I'm going to ask everybody that is on this digital dais here to turn their cameras back on. I'd like to invite questions. Now, I thought ideally that what we would do is take it in tranches, that we would do zoning board, planning board, and the governing body. But since we're all up here, maybe that really isn't necessary. I also want to open it to the public. So I'll wait to do that with the public until we've gone through any questions, pent up questions that everybody up here might have. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to ask or talk through?
Todd, can I just make one distinction real quick based off of Doug's presentation?
Sure.
I just wanted to clarify that single family homes do not require site plan. And for the most part, any single family home requiring bulk variance relief always goes to the zoning board. So the
Right.
planning board would never get a single family home requiring a side yard setback variance unless there was a very specific condition that I couldn't think of at the moment.
So one of the things I think Doug was pointing out was the distinction between the subdivision application and the need to review the site plan, and a conforming site plan, which may not require notice, and also the requirement that the applicant show, for example, what the houses are going to look like when they're done, because it isn't always necessary that they say, hey, I'm going to build this house. Once you've properly subdivided a lot, you get your independent right to build a conforming home. The ordinance is controlled just like any other lot.
Exactly.
But thank you for pointing that out, because that's why the zoning board is so busy. Any pre-existing single-family home that requires some sort of, relief comes immediately to the zoning board.
Todd, I had a question. Does all pre-existing non-conforming issues have to go before a board, or can they be dispatched by the zoning officer?
It's a great question. Doug, you prepared to answer that?
Depending on how your ordinance is configured, generally speaking, if it is not exacerbating the condition, in other words, you're not increasing the nonconformity. My gut reaction is you shouldn't have to come before a board. I'd want to know what the specific facts of it are. But if you're not exacerbating a pre-existing condition, you should not have to come before any of the boards. If you are increasing we had this issue not too long ago with regard to one of the municipalities where we actually ended up in a case of pre-existing non-conforming residential structure. It was one of those lot cases where there were multi-structures on the property, and all the applicant wanted to do was add heat to the structure. One of the structures, one of the, I think it was 3 structures on a single lot. And the municipality and the board that I took the position of, no, that's an expansion of the non-conforming use, because now, in addition to having 3 non-conforming structures, if you allow this one structure to get heat, and it's permitted, to the board's way of thinking, even though it's not been done yet, pretty soon we're going to get the applications for the other 2 structures. And to the extent now that non-permitted pre-existing use will now be longer in its duration throughout the year. In other words, it's even though without heat you weren't going to have it in the winter time, now with heat you'd be able to continue that non-conformity for a greater period of time than you had before. We took the position that in that instance, even though that there was no physical change to the footprint, the expansion by adding heat expanded the non-conformity throughout the year, and the court ruled in our favor with regard to that interpretation. But generally speaking, if you're not going to be exacerbating or expanding that nonconformity, I don't believe you should go before a board.
Doug, to find the hard one. Dr. Laufer, no. So basically, this is my response to that question. So if you have an existing home and you want to build an addition on that home, and your entire addition is conforming, so your entire addition conforms to the setbacks, think about what it would mean if the borough would be able to say, no, you can't do that because the location of your house is not consistent with the current zoning. We have a grandfather ordinance which permits those pre-existing nonconformities to remain. And the question is whether or not you're exacerbating. Now, Doug raised an issue, and that is, in his case, there was an argument that they were exacerbating a nonconformity and they were creating a condition. But in the simple case of, a bulk standard that isn't met, the issue is whether or not there's exacerbation. And in Nick's knockdown letters, he will identify where the pre-existing nonconformities come up. And you'll see in our hearings, we go through it all the time, and we just kind of dispose of them. It's relevant to what we're looking at. But if you can imagine saying no to somebody only based on pre-existing nonconformities, my lot's too small, I don't have enough coverage, that would be a taking. they're not letting me do what everybody else can do because my lot's a little smaller. And so we don't have that problem because of our grandfather ordinance.
Thank you.
Todd, I'm sorry, Todd, if I could, can I add to that? Would that be okay?
Absolutely, Greg, please do.
Sure. So the grandfather ordinance is chapter 30-7.3I in Fairhaven. And it's exactly what you just said. Construction, alteration, or expansion of a non-conforming structure shall be permitted, and a development permit shall be issued by the zoning officer, provided that there's four conditions. The proposed work complies with all the regulations in the zone. The proposed work does not increase, exacerbate, or change the specifics of any existing nonconformity. 3, the proposed work does not add volume to the structure outside the permitted setback lines within the zone in which the property is located, meaning you're not going out the same way that you're not conforming. And 4, the proposed work complies with all the regulations of the zone. It's actually a little more permissive than you guys were even describing, because if you're not, basically you can build on the other side of the house if you wanted to, in the situation you described.
I'm super familiar with it because when I started on the zoning board in 06, we had that ordinance, but it was not being enforced. And people were being sent to the boards, the zoning board particularly, for pre-existing nonconformities. And so we, through a discussion and we basically started to implement it. And that makes a lot of sense because we have a lot of non-conforming lots and a lot of non-conforming structures in Fairhaven. And so freeing people to build and expand those in conforming ways is a very, in my view, sensible way for us to permit people to develop and redevelop.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I might borrow that ordinance because I'm the borough attorney for Bradley Beach as well, which has it's a beachfront set, which is not dissimilar from the land value situation that's occurring in Fairhaven on a general basis. And this is obviously one of the things that comes up. So thank you.
We have a small licensing fee, Greg, but we can work that out.
I have a question, if I may.
Please, Delaney.
So my understanding is that for the D variance, that goes to the zoning board, but there's concurrent powers for C variances between planning board and zoning board. So at least theoretically, they could be hearing similar cases. And I'm just wondering, what's the process to make sure that decisions being made by the zoning board it would be done in a similar way as if it had gone to the other board? How do we make sure that decisions are being made in a way that is consistent between the two boards?
So I'm going to react quickly, and then I'll let Doug give you the real answer. First of all, because the zoning officer decides where it goes, you can't forum shop. You can't say, I prefer the planning board to the zoning board. They don't do exactly the same things. It's too detailed for this conversation. But the truth is that when you put it through the filter, it goes in one direction or another based on that. Now, with regard to how you would apply a C1 variance at the planning board and the zoning board, there's one reason it's going to be interpreted consistently. And that is because it should be interpreted consistent with the MLUO and the case law based on the testimony that the board hears with regard to the variance. So when we stick with the rules and when we apply the rules even-handedly across the applications, there's never a concern that the planning board, the zoning board, 2008, 2018 applied it differently. We're not supposed to. The whole idea is that we stick with the rules because that leads us to a consistent and yet case by case specific result. Doug, it wasn't as quick as I thought, but you have a better answer?
No, I would absolutely agree that as I say, it goes but one way. If it is D variance relief or D variance relief is required, the zoning board of adjustment is going to be exercising that C variance relief if it's also associated with that application. If you're applying the same standards, we should get the same results. If you're still requiring the applicant to meet its burden, I agree with Todd, you should be getting the same results. It's not an independent determination. If anything, where the zoning board is acting, we're going to have additional proofs because you probably have a D variance involved.
One of the things that happens, Alini, is that each applicant is very different. Do they have an attorney? Do they not have an attorney? Are they familiar with what's going on or are they not? And one of the things that the boards will regularly do is extract from the applicant the things that they need to hear and see in order to substantiate a variance. The board is always susceptible to being challenged, whether it's on an approval or a denial. So while the applications themselves differ, the information should always be a part of that conversation. And if you're listening to or participating in a meeting where you hear the board drawing those things out of the applicant, they're trying to establish those proofs. They're trying to themselves elicit what's necessary to say yes or no. Because if the applicant comes in and says, I want a variance, and just folds their hand, the board can do nothing. You do the best you can.
I have a question. When the affordable housing ordinances are finally adopted and approved by the court, can the boards anticipate having to deal with some other sorts of applications than we're used to if developers come in and start making use of the new zoning, say around the Acme? Are they going to be able to ask for variances from the fair share plan, or is it going to be set in stone?
Good job.
I'm having some connection problems in hearing that last question.
So Pat was asking whether or not when the affordable housing overlays are implemented, whether or not there will be any difference in how those potential variances are interpreted by the boards. Pat, you want to know whether or not these new rules are more strict and less likely to be deviated from by the boards as part of applications, right?
Generally, just whether they're going to be able to come in and seek, say, variances from the fair share plan if they're trying to build a development.
I think our courts have been fairly consistent in their ruling with regard to Mount Laurel housing, the fair share plans, just as they have with regard to redevelopment ordinances. An applicant, whether they're building in a redevelopment area, whether they're building Mount Laurel housing, they still have the same right to come before you and make their requests for variances. And, if they carry the day, they're entitled to that relief. What I'm seeing is, again, most boards saying, look, we just did these ordinances. We know these can work. Demonstrate to us why you either have a hardship on this particular parcel, or demonstrate to us why your proposal is a better proposal under the C2 than what's there. And again, even if you were proposing, specifically if you're proposing Mount Laurel housing in an area that's not permitted for that,
No, I'm assuming
you still have those same burdens. I think you still have the same burdens. You still have your burden of proof, and you're not precluded from making those applications on a case-by-case basis.
So we need to know that that new statute and the ordinances that are being developed around that inclusionary housing stuff, right?
The ordinances for the affordable housing look just like all the others. What's different about it is that they're designed to permit the density. So, and that process is running through the court. So when we get to the end and the court says that you've done what you're supposed to do, you've zoned in a way that permits enough density to get the affordable units in there, those standards are going to be treated just like any of the other zoning standards. And you'll have the weight of the fact that it's affordable housing. But something that Doug just mentioned, we will have just reviewed it. Like so many times you're looking at ordinances that are 20 and 30 years old. These were just done. And so if somebody comes in and says, I can't possibly meet this standard, then, it's current and we'll have to understand why that's being argued.
Great, thanks.
I have one more question. In terms of training, what kind of training are members of the planning board and zoning board expected to have, or over the years? Is there a process for that?
Yes. Yes, there is. And in fact, the state requires our new members to go through land use training. It is in, I didn't do the usual attorney disclaimers during this presentation. The attorney disclaimers I would give you is that this is not intended as a substitute for that training. The state requires each one of our members to go through training that is provided by the state with regard to land use. It's going to involve many of the same things that we talked about, the areas of jurisdiction, but it will also cover things like the Open Public Meetings Act. It will cover issues concerning conflicts of interest. It will cover C variances, D variances, zoning boards, planning boards. It will get a little more into the reads of those types of things because it's going to be specifically designed not for a broad brush stroke for everyone here, but for members that are actually going to be taking that action. So yes, they are required to conduct that training. The reason we have done this is because as is so often the case, you know, we brought a new member on this evening. They're expected to hit the ground running, so to speak. And at least we're trying to provide them with a little additional guidance because obviously the person has not taken their training yet from the state, but there is some state training that's required. And on a periodic basis, where there are new rules or regulations, not too long ago, there were some revisions to stormwater management. We had to get information and all of our members had to review those stormwater management regulation changes and demonstrate an understanding of those changes, even though they'd already gone through the state training. Periodically, when new pieces come up that are important, we'll be given an obligation to do that. If you don't complete that training, you jeopardize your ability to continue to serve.
I got a question. And first of all, thanks for kind of going through a lot of this stuff. Even as somebody who's just, you know, rounded out the first year on the board and done one training, a lot of the stuff is, like you say, it's dense, and it's, if you don't not around it every day, it's helpful to go over from time to time. You talk a lot about subdivisions and, you know, taking lots and dividing them in two. Do we ever hear about going the other way when one lot might want to join with the lot next door to create a larger property? In my experience, I've not heard one of those presented. I'm just curious if that comes up a lot in Fairhaven.
I don't know if it comes up a lot in Fairhaven. I've seen it happen before, not too long ago in one of the municipalities I represent. There was an issue on a subdivided parcel backing up on some Green Acres land, and the municipality wanted to reconfigure that so that they could put a municipal building on that. So in a sense, what they were doing was adding to and sort of taking a different slice out, but ultimately making a smaller lot than what they'd originally granted. And so there was a grandfather back. Sometimes you'll see things like that in redevelopment areas. I don't know that you're going to see a lot of that in Fairhaven, but sometimes where a redevelopment requires you to garner together parcels of certain size, in order to do that, sometimes you're combining a lot. You know, you're going the other way. That's still referred to as a subdivision.
Okay.
You know, say you decided in a redevelopment area that now all of your parcels for development had to be, you know, 150 by 150 lots. And this is in an area that traditionally was, you know, 50 by 100. You got to scramble to put some parcels together. Usually a redevelopment area gives you those tools to do that, but you will see a recombining of lots. There are also some things that happen automatically when undersized lots are in joint ownership. That happens by actual law, but again, that's something they'll get into the reads, but you do see it go the other way.
You
Yeah.
mentioned municipality taking space. Is that like kind of an eminent domain type of thing? Is that?
It wasn't in that instance. And again, that eminent domain would be a discussion for another course. But, I guess something like that could happen. And again, usually when you're taking for an eminent domain, I'm trying to think of something recent that happened. I know a municipality was taking some property. It was sort of a friendly eminent domain, but what they were doing was cobbling together some parcels to make a large park.
So David, the most interesting thing I think about two lots coming together is that it's called a subdivision. It's just, but economically, you don't see it happen a lot. If two separate legal lots are owned in common ownership, there's no merger of those two lots as a matter of law. But if they're two non-conforming lots, the law merges them because the law wants conformity. The issue, the rub, if you're consolidating, and I have not seen one in 15 years working on the board, is that all of a sudden when you combine the lots, that line in the middle gets erased. And now when you establish your bulk standards for that new combined lot, you're now doing it based on the combination of the two. And I have to assume that there's a circumstance where that would be something odd and that a board might have something to say about it. But as a practical matter, usually even when they come into common ownership, there's an intent to keep them separate because they're more valuable that way, and to develop them in a way that is consistent with, them being, whether it's a boathouse or a pool house or, something like that.
Great, thank you.
Enough awkward pauses. Going twice. All right, I don't know how many members of the public have been watching the numbers as we've been talking. I'm going to invite any members of the public who have any questions of our expert Doug. Ooh, there's a hand right away. Teresa.
I got it, Tom.
Very good.
Go ahead.
Hi, it's Carolyn Ferguson. Just on the issue of combining properties, I was just going to comment. I think it's probably more common in commercial properties than residential. I'm not sure. And I think we may have an example in our town. I believe when Forefront built, they had two properties that became one.
Thank you, Carolyn. That's got to be a good example because they built that building across both of those lots. So
Yeah.
They don't respect the subdivision. I wasn't on the planning board then, so I'm not familiar with it, but that's probably a great example of one.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Any other members of the public have any questions or comments with regard to the discussion from tonight? TC, is that your hand?
Yep.
Hi, I'm TC, Tracy Cole, 123 Gray Ave.
Good evening, Tracy.
Hi, I just wanted to say thanks for doing this. And it's intricate and a little complex and nuanced all at the same time, but land use and planning is also a reflection of our shared values, and this collection of decisions over time is what creates the community we all know and love. And in that way, it's something that's very meaningful and impactful. And so I appreciate you taking the time to take us through it in the way you have tonight. I wonder, Mr. Kovacs, could you explain, so the purpose for sending a land use ordinance to the planning board after it's introduced by the governing body, as I understand it, is to check it for conformity. Does it advance the goals of the master plan, check or no check? Is that correct? And can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, the standard is that the planning board, well, several things. It is to be submitted to the planning board for review and or comment, or not, within 35 days. If 35 days passes and there is no comment from the planning board, Governing body continues to proceed usually to what's referred to as second reading and adoption. In a sense, if the planning board took no action or did not review it, it doesn't stop what the municipality does. The planning board's role as articulated in the statute, and I think it's in like 25 or something along those 26, basically to review the ordinance. I don't want to pick nits, but that's what attorneys do. I don't know that we're checking it, but we're reviewing it for consistency with the master plan and the zone plan and zoning ordinances. We're seeing a lot of that right now because there's been a change in cell site for 5G. The old ordinances, a lot of places had all covered the old cell phones, but now under 5G, a lot of municipalities are revamping their ordinances. And sometimes you're checking to see, and I know we recently raised it as an issue in another municipality, whether or not this was a duplication of effort and or whether or not the standards for review appear to be inconsistent with what we had done in the past with cell reviews with ordinances presently on the books. And that was one of those where, quite frankly, the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. And that's why they centrally locate that with the planning board, because they said, oh yeah, let's take a look at that. And, streamlined it, updated it for the 5G, but streamlined the review process to be consistent with what we had done in the past, rather than reinventing the wheel and having an additional ordinance that pretty much accomplished the same thing by way of the review process. So it's checking for consistency. And as I've said in the past, even if the planning board were to come to a conclusion that, this ordinance appears to be for one reason or another inconsistent with the zoning ordinances or the zone plan, the governing body can still pass that ordinance. It just makes it from a simple majority to a 3/4 majority, if you will, to approve that ordinance. What usually happens in the course of that is if there is something that is easily recognized and it wasn't the intent of mayor and council to do those things, they'll make those changes to the ordinance so that it is consistent. But in either way, we are simply advisory. They can accept our advice or not.
Understood. I'll just as a follow-up, I appreciate the example you gave. I think speaking for myself, and I know a lot of other residents feel strongly about this, preserving the pedestrian environment and preserving our small town character and the sort of charms of Fairhaven are really paramount in many minds. And when applications come before boards that may compromise those things, which are evident in the master plan, have been outlined as goals of the master plan, we would look to the boards to guard those goals. And I wanted to really just to state that clearly at tonight's meeting. This is an unusual forum, but a great opportunity. And once again, I thank you for doing it. And I appreciate the opportunity to be heard.
Thank you, Tracy. So I certainly think that one of the reasons why I thought it was important to tie everything back to the MLUL and the master plan is so everybody has sort of a right now focus on how these things are connected. Tracy's point with regard to what's in the master plan and the opportunity to review an ordinance is important. Just to give two examples, there's the affordable housing ordinance that comes in tonight. It's a couple of commas, it's a tweak, it's been given to us by council. And a couple of years ago, we got a proposed change to the ordinance that related to the restaurant ordinance at the very time that we were looking at Dunkin' Donuts. And the planning board at that time had all sorts of ongoing thoughts about what the ordinances looked like. And so those two examples of, that opportunity as set forth in the MLUL for the planning board to play its role are very different examples, of how this plays out in real life. But I do think it's good that we all have a reminder tonight about, how these things are tied together and where it all comes from. Any other questions or comments from any members of the public? And I'm gonna shift from asking about what we talked about tonight and say that if you have any comments or questions with regard to anything else, really anything else, but anything else that would be of interest for the planning board,
Within the jurisdiction of the planning board.
within the jurisdiction, which now everybody understands very well. I'm not seeing anything. So is everybody good? Did everybody have the chance to ask their questions? Everybody have the handle on what we were trying to convey tonight? Doug, I want to thank you. As everybody on the planning board would know, this sort of started with Doug's idea. You know, Jesse, this is all for you. This started with the idea that we could do some training with some of our downtime because we didn't have an agenda tonight. And so, you know, I really kind of took that and I pulled back and made it from 20,000 feet, thinking it would be really good to do this. It would be my hope to try to continue to engage in some discussion within our downtime as to other things that may be a little bit more specific to Fairhaven, and try and, you know, maintain the ongoing discussion with the public and between the planning board and the zoning board and the council, across all of those lines, because I think that the MLUL provides a structure for us to work within, but it's not the only way that we can communicate and try and work together. Certainly the zoning board, you know, sees a lot of stuff. And while the MLUL provides no role to the zoning board, you know, to provide thoughts and comments, I know that there are members of council that value what the zoning board members see. And I think that through the zoning board's annual report and their opportunity through their relationships to communicate about what they're seeing, there's a very real opportunity to influence things. You know, I mentioned the grandfather ordinance when I first came on in 2006. Like, somebody called me. They were like, "Oh, you're on the zoning board? Why don't we pay attention to this ordinance?" And I kind of looked into it and I said, "Yeah, why don't we do that?" So I called a couple of council members and we looked at it and we kind of all scratched our head and we changed it. You know, and people stopped having to come to the zoning board just because of pre-existing nonconformities. And it was really good. It was kind of low-hanging fruit. But there's opportunities. There's always opportunities to make the system better and to try to look forward and make sure that we're ready, because change is coming and everything's always changing and all that other stuff.
And if I could dovetail on that, Todd, just very briefly, again, everything comes with a plan. And I think one of the benefits that we get is a very detailed report from the zoning board of adjustment. You know, if you're constantly seeing, going back to the grandfather ordinance, if you're constantly seeing relief being granted, not too long ago, another municipality I represent, you know, people were coming in and a lot of folks didn't have problems, even though the house wasn't, even though the front porch was encroaching upon the front yard setback. Nobody really had a problem with an open porch in the front yard, and constantly variances were being granted for these. And there was this sort of, I don't know, these gymnastics with resolutions as to how this met the C1 or C2 criteria or something like that, you know, was to allow these structures to encroach upon the front yard. And, you know, if you're constantly seeing that, you don't really want to rule by variance. If you're seeing that, and you don't have a problem, maybe it's time to take a look at that and say, you know what, as this municipality did, you know, if it doesn't encroach into the setback more than X amount of feet, and it doesn't create more, and it's, you know, it's not an enclosed structure, and it's, you know, it just has a roof over top of it, that kind of a thing, we're going to allow, and they came up with a formula to allow the front porches. You know, that's what I think the zoning board of adjustments work is helpful. You know, the planning board knows what it's doing, but to see if there's some consistency of routine variances that are being granted. Maybe it's time to take a look at those ordinances, go back to mayor and council. And though usually it comes from mayor and council down, it's not unusual for a planning board or a zoning board of adjustment. Usually it's the planning board to make a recommendation to mayor and council to take a look at that because of what we're seeing. And if they don't have a problem, maybe make those modifications.
Well, I'll say another thing that I hear from time to time is, oh, is there another subdivision? You know, why is the planning board allowing that? Well, that's not the case at all. I mean, most of the subdivisions that I've seen in the last 5 or 10 years are fully conforming subdivisions. And what I think that, as board members, we all need to be mindful of is to make sure that the public, to the extent that you understand and can help them through it, how it works. We've got one set of rules. It applies to everybody equally. And I don't care if the lot that you're trying to subdivide has been this beautiful pillar for the community as an oversized lot forever. If it's 2 legally conforming lots, you've got the right to subdivide it. And I'll dovetail into my last point, which is that the boards don't determine what we get and what we don't get. The boards determine where we deviate from what the council has set forth in the ordinances. So if you don't like something, don't call your local planning board member, your zoning board member, and say, I don't like this. We got to go to council. Betsy specifically. Betsy, can we have your cell phone number, please? You got Betsy, you got Megan, you got Mike on the line, you got Lalini on the line, you got Greg, he runs the joint. The point is that the boards do what the boards do, but the boards don't set the policy. And so all of this needs to go back to the council. And when we see things that we don't like, we don't fix it at the board level. We change the rules for everybody consistently with thought to make sure that we're ready for whatever it is that we see Fairhaven being next. And I think that is an important takeaway that everybody should understand. These boards only do what these boards do. The ordinances come from council and we can change them. All right. Okay, nothing further?
I'd like to jump in here, Todd. It's not lost on me to thank everyone. Everyone here is a volunteer, and Fairhaven would never be able to function without our many very knowledgeable volunteers. And I will tell you that I had the great fortune to work with Todd for many years now, but none more so than these past few years when we've been working on the Fair Share Housing plan and settlement and ordinances. And Todd has been a wealth of information and given up a great deal of his time to try to get it right or help get it right for the borough. And he's really to be applauded for his efforts. He has a wealth of knowledge that's invaluable to Fairhaven. I often joke that I don't mind if we call him the land czar in Fairhaven. He's that good. So this was, certainly a good evening, and I thank everyone for attending, and I certainly look forward to working with everybody in the future.
Thank you, Teresa. We're all a part of this process. I pitch in where I can, but there's a lot of faces on this screen, and we all have a job to do when these applications come in and when we're involving ourselves. And these are important spots. And those of you that either I interviewed before you got it, or that I've recommended, or that we've become friends since you've gotten it, it means a lot. It really does. This is the way that we give back. We have to engage in this process. If you don't like something, you engage. If you want to matter, you engage. And I thank everybody for their time tonight. I know this got a little long. I'm sorry for the technical issues. I'm sorry that it was dry. It just happens to be dry. We're very, very fortunate that Doug gave such a great presentation and for his wealth of knowledge. He does a great job directing the planning board and helping us make good decisions. So thank you again, Doug. I appreciate it very much.
Pleasure.
With that, I'll make a motion to close the meeting. All in favor?
Aye. Thank you, Todd.
All right, terrific. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Yep. Good night. Good night.
Everybody, be well.
Good night.
Night.